Today, we're talking about separation anxiety in dogs and how we can help dogs who can't bear to be left alone. And we're joined by someone who specializes in separation anxiety cases and who has actually transformed the way that dog trainers work with people and their dogs in these cases. So that's Malena DeMartini. I'm super excited that we're joined by her today. Welcome to the Positive Post in Conversation. I'm Zazie Todd. I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host Christy Benson. Hey, Christy, don't you think this is a really important topic?
Absolutely, and it affects so many dogs, so it's really good just to keep this conversation going.
Absolutely. So we're very lucky to have Malena here. Malena DeMartini is a certified trainer and counselor and a certified dog behavior consultant. Since 2001, she has specialized exclusively in canine separation anxiety, having worked hundreds of cases and constantly innovating to find better ways to treat the condition and to support guardians, other trainers, rescues, and shelters. So Malena is the author of two groundbreaking books, Separation Anxiety in Dogs, Next Generation in Treatment Protocols and Practices, which was published in 2020, and Treating Separation Anxiety in Dogs as well. And she's the founder of the prestigious Separation Anxiety Certification Program, which has graduated hundreds of CSATs across the globe. And she also has an online self-paced course called Mission Possible, which is an invaluable resource. Welcome to the show, Malena.
Oh, thank you for such a wonderful, warm welcome. I appreciate it. And one of the things that Christy just said was this is such an important topic because so many dogs are suffering. And I want to make a shout out to, as are the people who love them, because this is hard.
It is hard. It definitely is hard. So let's start with the question of what is separation anxiety for people who might not know.
Yeah, so separation anxiety, first of all, it's a little bit of a misnomer. If I had my druthers, I probably would change what we call it, but obviously, separation anxiety is the familiar term publicly, and even to some extent in the research. So, if it were up to me, I would call it separation phobia. And basically, these are dogs who are suffering from fear, anxiety, and stress when left alone. And the reason I mentioned that word phobia as a potential title is that by definition, phobias are very irrational to those individuals that are not experiencing them, but very real to the individual who is, in this case, the dog, right? So we typically are like, I come home every time. Why is my dog so upset about alone time? And so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us, but it is incredibly real and generally terrifying for many dogs to that suffer with this to be alone.
I think in the sort of the dog training realm, I've seen, just going back to your conversation about what would you call it, I've seen discussions, and I'm not a separation anxiety expert. I refer as fast as you could possibly refer if someone came to me with a question about it. But I've seen, people talking about different labels, maybe different differential diagnoses. Is this a useful conversation? Does it change practice? I'm thinking I've seen terms like isolation distress and this kind of thing.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I actually want to start with the beginning piece of what you said about so many terms, so many labels. Um, Separation anxiety, as I kind of mentioned, is really the more familiar term with the general public. The research really has a number of different ways to identify this sort of syndrome of dogs that are suffering and distressed when alone. The more commonly used terminology now in the research is separation related behaviors or separation related problems. And so that's what we're seeing come up more often. But still, the general public is going to refer to it as separation anxiety. Isolation distress is an interesting label because we actually don't see it in the research. It is sort of a fabricated term that has become popularized in the general language of our industry and with the general public. And while all of the terms are sort of synonymous with a similar type of intervention, uh, isolation distress does, even though it's not a clinical diagnosis in any way, shape, or form, does have a different meaning behind it. So the difference between separation anxiety and isolation distress is simple. Separation anxiety, understood by the general public, is a dog who needs their primary caretaker or primary caretakers, maybe two people or so, to be present in order for them to be comfortable. Isolation distress, conversely, is they need a warm human being with them in order for them to be comfortable. And I would say that rarely do I see dogs that are entirely on one end of the spectrum or the other. They're somewhere in the middle. Some dogs prefer their primary caregiver, but they're okay with some other people. And so they're somewhere along that spectrum. And I think the real difference that comes in practice between those two is simply that those that really need their primary caregiver in order to be comfortable, we need to help those dogs expand their circle so that that circle of people that they can be comfortable with is bigger than just the one or two individuals. But the actual implementation of the day-to-day training and the gradual systematic exposure to alone time is quite similar, albeit individualized to the dog in front of us.
So, when you're working with someone whose dog has separation anxiety, you ask people to suspend absences, basically not to leave the dog at home alone for any longer than they're comfortable with. So, what does it mean to do that? And can you give us an example of how you might work through a series of carefully timed absences or missions with people?
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. I think it's such an important question for so many reasons. If I just say to someone, well, in order to do this training, you're never, ever, 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 ever going to leave your dog alone for longer than they can handle. It doesn't necessarily have to be with you individually, but it has to be, the dog will have to be with someone. Well, that's a big ask. And I want to recognize and shout out, like, it is a big ask. However, a couple things about that. It is a temporary ask because we're talking about not leaving the dog alone for longer than they can handle. And maybe today they can only handle 1 minute or even 1 second. But with time and training and implementing a systematic protocol, that will grow. And so in time, we're going to be able to leave that dog for a half an hour and then maybe an hour and an hour and a half and 3 and 4 and whatever the goal may be. So it is a temporary request. And the other thing I want to mention about it, which I think is super important, this is not Malena got up on her high horse and decided people should just not leave their dogs alone. The laws of learning are such that if we're trying to teach a dog that alone time is safe, while simultaneously leaving them for very scary, overwhelmingly long absences, we are not going to make progress. Management is an essential tool, and this is basically managing absences is essential for allowing these animals to learn in a systematic and gradual way without continuing to expose them to this overwhelming fear. So once the guardian has decided that they're ready to move forward, yes, we start to work with our clients with what we call missions. And that's what I started calling them, and it just sort of stuck. So, and a mission is created based on the individual dog, their environment, and their caretaker, their primary caretaker. So never will you see, I'm going to copy today's mission from Buddy's workbook to, Fluffy's workbook. There will never be the same two missions for different dogs. And the way that those missions are created is that we observe the dog in real time during a brief alone time absence and determine at what point in time that dog starts to show us signs of escalating indicators of distress. And that will allow us to create criteria based on that individual dog's needs. Based on that observation, we write 1 day, just 1 day of training. And that training takes about 20 to 30 minutes. It's comprised of maybe 10, 11, 12 steps, individual tiny little exposures. And the guardian, the client, will write some notes as to what they observed during that mission. And based on those notes, we as the trainers will say, oh, this is what they saw. So this informs me as to what I'm going to do tomorrow in my training session for this client tomorrow. So as you can imagine, this is very customized and tailored to the dog, to their environment, and to the individual client. But it's also allowing for the dog to set the pace of the protocol. And I think that's the most important thing about getting separation anxiety training right. Because if you just go on the internet and say, how do I fix my dog that suffers with this issue? It'll say gradual exposure, start with a minute, then go to 3, then go to 7, then go to 10. And that formulaic or algorithmic kind of percentage increase is actually what can lead to the opposite of desensitization. Desensitization's evil twin, which is sensitization, which is worsening of the problem.
I like how you sort of wove in discussion about the video, which is about our next question. So you use a lot of video, and as we were considering like asking these questions, I was reminded of my favorite instance of separation anxiety videoings. I was fostering this dog who was a new tripod, but somehow had managed to escape out of like a 6-foot pen. So we were thinking, oh God, this new 4-limb tripod was, climbing out of this giant wall of a pen. Maybe the dog has separation anxiety. So I asked a CSAT, a friend of mine, to do an assessment, and I got in the car and drove away, and we were on the phone, and she was like, Christy, so an orange dog jumped up on the table in front of the camera. So she was like worried I was going to be upset or something about this, because one of my sled dogs like to sit on the table when no one was around, and like just got in the way. And it ended up the tripod did not have separation anxiety, so it was all good news.
Oh,
but
good.
Gosh, just,
oh, good.
I always laugh at that idea of just how gentle she was as a practitioner, just being like, Christy, just so you're aware, there's an orange dog on the table. And I'm like, oh, I got pictures of that already. It's okay.
That's a daily thing. It's all good. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you touched on this a bit, but just a little bit more, so in a little bit more depth, what kind of signs are you looking for that a dog is okay? She looked for signs that this tripod was okay. What would she be looking for?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And I'm sorry to say it's going to be a dog trainer, it depends kind of an answer, but I will follow up with the it depends. So we are looking to identify the sort of general point at which the dog is no longer comfortable with alone time and is showing signs of distress, signs of fear, anxiety, and stress. And when we observe a dog, there are indicators that they are approaching that point. Oftentimes we refer to that as threshold. I refer to it as the threshold of stimulus aversiveness. Because there's multiple thresholds that can be identified, but that's the one that we're really wanting to be ensured that we're identifying for the purposes of creating criteria. So what I really have to be careful with, and that's why I say it depends, it would be really very easy to say, well, once the dog is barking, or once the dog is whining, or once the dog is jumping up on the door and scratching, then I know that he or she is distressed, or those are the signals I'm looking for. But it's so individual to the dog in front of us. I can tell you, I have watched dogs who lie on their bed staring stiffly at the door and just profusely drool. That's a very different presentation than the dog that is, tearing at the door and barking and howling and whining. And yet both are showing us signs of extreme distress. So it's not an actual type of indicator or symptom, if you will, that we're looking for. We're looking for the actual escalation in frequency or intensity that is getting towards, oh, this dog is now really distressed. And the way that I try to identify this with your average caretaker is, when you look at your dog and there's a point at which you go, oh wow, my dog is absolutely freaking out. Okay, technical term here, freaking out. So you, your brother, your cousin, everybody says, yeah, that's for sure freaking out. Well, what happens before that? And then what happens before that? And then what happens before that? And we get to a point where I identify that was the point at which it started to escalate in frequency and intensity toward the point at which the dog was, quote, freaking out. So that's what we're watching, and not necessarily a specific symptom, because some dogs won't ever whine or bark.
I think that's really helpful for people to know. And then there's another thing about separation anxiety, which I think some people struggle with. I mean, it's such a hard thing overall for people to deal with, but many dogs are put on medications by their vets, and we hear some people concerned or having, questions about that. So none of us are veterinarians, but what do you say to clients about the need to speak to their vet about separation anxiety?
Yeah. Well, as you just mentioned, none of us are veterinarians, and so obviously I'm very careful with the discussions that I have with my clients. I want the decision to ultimately and importantly be resting with the veterinarian and the client themselves. It is not up to me in either direction. What I do think is important, however, is from the very beginning of a protocol, or from the very moment that they're concerned about their dog's alone time behavior, I think a caretaker should inform their veterinarian. And if they haven't recently had a thorough examination and vet check, they should do so. The majority of the time, yes, it is simply alone time behavior that's a problem, but there are differential diagnoses. There are different types of medical issues that can present in a way that look very much like separation anxiety. So we want to make sure that those are being ruled out. And I like to have the vet as part of the team and collaborating from the very beginning, because at some point in time, when the vet feels ready, when the client feels ready, when the dog is showing signs that they may need some pharmacological support, then we're ready they're ready to have that conversation if and when that happens. The other thing that I like to remind clients, because there is some hesitation, like the most common comment that I get is, well, I don't want my dog's personality to change, or I don't want them to be a zombie. I don't want to drug my dog. And so I like to remind guardians that the purpose of medication with separation anxiety is to enhance learning and retention. It's not to like dope the dog up so that they don't care about being alone. It is truly to enhance that learning and retention, so that when these gradual exposures are being incorporated, the dog can now learn more efficiently and retain better that alone time is safe.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that framing.
Mm,
Seems like it
yeah.
would be very useful for clients to understand. Yeah. So another thing that we sort of see, I think, maybe less discussion from other trainers, but often from dog guardians, is the crate question. So, what's your gut reaction to crating in this context of separation
In this
anxiety?
context of separation anxiety, yes, and I will make a caveat. There are great purposes for crates. One of which is very near and dear to my heart, because I happen to live in fire season Northern California, and evacuating, you have to have your dog in a crate. And so, I think it's important that we all take some time to expose our dogs to be able to be comfortable as best as possible in a crate. But absolutely unequivocally, there is just so much evidence and support for not using a crate for separation anxiety training. The majority of dogs that suffer with alone time behavior problems have simultaneously experienced or do experience confinement anxiety. And the amount of sort of exacerbated issue that will happen if we're taking a dog who is distressed about being alone and then taking that overwhelming fear and confining it to a very small space, appropriate space or otherwise, this can really make for a much more difficult process. And many dogs, quite frankly, many dogs will not easily get past alone time plus confinements. And I want to make sure, though, that people understand, because the number one reason that people say, well, I have to crate my dog because my dog is destructive when alone. And I understand that, right? I understand, like, I need to protect my valuables, my property, my items in my home. But two things about that. Number one, that threshold that we talked about, we're always in this type of training staying beneath that threshold, that anxiety threshold. And the reason that these dogs are destructive, when and if they are, with respect to separation anxiety, is that's their outward manifestation of this extreme level of anxiety, is to chew and to scratch and to destroy things. If we're continually staying beneath their anxiety, then there will be no need for the dog to have the destructive behavior. So I want people to really remember that, about like that need to have a crate because they're destructive, but we're not going to be reaching those destructive behavior levels because we're not exposing them to absences that are inciting anxiety. And the other thing I want to say that I think is really important, if there's some concern, like, well, the dog sometimes gets into the garbage and or when alone, or the dog does sometimes chew the table legs, just, not just out of anxiety, but it's an adolescent, or whatever. I really want people to think about, let's not confine the dog within a space. Let's confine the dog out of spaces. So put the X pen around the garbage can, put the X pen around the table, put the laptop in, and desk in a crated or gated off area, as opposed to confining the dog. We can find the items that we are, concerned that might be interrupted.
I love that way of looking at it. Very much helpful for the dog.
Very,
Yeah.
very, and also helpful for the human, right? If I know that I have put a crate over my garbage can, I can be rest assured that those chicken bones that are somewhere in my garbage can cannot be chewed up by my dog because they cannot access it.
Mm. Great. So you run a course for trainers who want to learn how to work with separation anxiety cases. And we actually see some amazing trainers graduate and become CSATs. So please, can you tell us something about this course?
I will. I have to share this story because I think it's kind of funny. And Christy, you mentioned this right when we started. Like, I refer as quickly as I can when it comes to. So in 2013, I had already been specializing in this behavior issue for 12 years, and I kept getting requests like, write a book or teach a class or do, and I was like, yeah. Just was the furthest thing from my mind. But I did a large presentation, and we had several hundred people there. And I remember this is what inspired me to change my tune and sort of go ahead and write a book and go ahead and start a program. There were multiple people in the room, and I asked the audience, raise your hand if you're willing to take and work with a client that has very mild, distress about being alone. Handful of people that raised their hands, and I was like, oh, that's really great. And then I said, now keep your hand up if you will work with clients whose dogs have received landlord complaints, are destroying the household, are jumping out of second story windows, urinating and defecating around the et cetera, et cetera. So these more severe appearing, if you will, cases. And it was like, oh, hey, there's the one lady in the back. Fabulous. Thank you. So I realized that like it was such a almost pariah of a behavior, right? And it made me recognize that there was very little help out there for your average caretaker that was, had this problem with their dog. And so I decided to start the program, and I laughed. Veronica Bautel, who of Dog Biz, and I talked about getting this program started. And I said, it's going to last one session because everybody knows how to do systematic desensitization. And she said, let me know at the end of this program if because how it went, because she said, I am looking forward to laughing at the fact that you have no idea what you're starting here. And I was like, oh, okay. And now 11 years later, we have almost 300 certified separation anxiety trainers around the world. But I think what's important here to talk about is what the program offers. It's a 15-week program, and it is very, very intensive and quite comprehensive. And the one thing that I think, well, many things about the program that are really worth highlighting, but the one thing that I would really like to highlight is that it is a virtual one-on-one mentorship with a very small number of students per class. Every single assignment, which is very often over the course of that 15 weeks, receives individual feedback, lengthy individual feedback, quite frankly, from me, where I'm pointing out, this is great, and how can we adjust this? And I see where you were thinking about that, but why don't we bring in this other element? And it's individualized to each student because every student brings a different lens to this program based on their background and experience. So it's sort of like a group process that is really mentoring each individual student. The feedback loop that we support throughout this program is just constant. It is a constant means of communication and feedback, both directions. And I love to honor each individual student's abilities and thoughts and questions. There are webinars and lessons that are released every Tuesday and Friday. And then every Tuesday and Friday, we also meet to talk about the previous lesson. We meet for an hour and a half collectively. It is live. It is not a self-paced course. There are no automated, like, take this quiz and then you pass kind of thing. It is really intense. And I say that not to scare people away, but because I feel like dogs deserve that. Dogs that are suffering with separation anxiety deserve that level of expertise, care, and skill from a certified separation anxiety trainer. They deserve that kind of specific, customized, individualized, tailored to that dog in front of them support. And one of the things that the students learn in our program is how to work with clients 5 days a week, how to track tons of data. Then that data drives the information. The information from the data drives our criteria choices, right? So it is a very data-driven process that is also quite driven by the human element and the relationship that we uphold with our clients. So it's a pretty intense course that takes a lot out of everyone. But I don't I don't say I'm proud of many things, but I know that I feel very proud of the program that I run.
Absolutely. I think you should be. I think it's made such a difference. And it's so good to be able, like Christy says, to refer people to CSATs for separation anxiety issues. So, yes, I think the course and the book's definitely very much things to be proud of. And this is a really fascinating discussion, but it's time for us to move on to the book section. So, what have you been reading lately that you absolutely loved?
Well, I think you're going to laugh, but I hope you laugh with me, not at me. I thought about because I'm an avid reader, and I thought about everything that I'm reading, and I love it all. And I thought I can't decide, but literally just a few days ago, a colleague of mine sent me a book, and it touched me so much. But it is a children's book. And I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of this book. It's called The Dot. And it is so inspiring. And I'll give you the like short and skinny that the character in this book says, I can't draw, I can't draw, I am not an artist. And the educator says, just put your pen on the paper and draw a dot. And so she draws this dot, and the teacher frames it and asks her to sign it and frames it and puts it in front of the classroom and says, this student has created this lovely piece of art. And then the student, of course, says, well, I can do a better dot than that dot, and then starts to get creative and ultimately, blossoms into creating some beautiful art with dots, of course, but, expanded. And I just think it's such a great inspirational thought about how often we say, I can't do that, or I'm not good at that. And I feel like just putting the dot on the piece of paper is where we all have to start. And I know personally from staring at a blank computer screen saying, I'm going to write a blog, just putting some words on the paper is sort of that beginning step. So it has been a fun, inspirational read that just happened to come to my doorstep in this last few days. And I thought I would share that.
I love that, and I can relate to that as well. Who is it by, and is it illustrated by someone as well?
Yes, the author is Peter Reynolds. And yeah, no, yes, Peter Reynolds is also the illustrator.
Also the illustrator. Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, it's
Brilliant.
it's really a lovely book. So
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us about separation anxiety and the kinds of things that people can do. If someone wants to learn more about you and about the course, or where to find a CSAT, if they want to hire a CSAT, where do they go?
yeah, the best place probably where everything is housed, be it for dog professionals, dog guardians, shelter rescue, etc., is my website, and it is malenademartini.com. So just my name. DE, not DI. That's a common error, but it seems to direct to my website anyway. I think there's been enough of those looked up that it seems to go to my website regardless. Um, I also have some social media channels that are under, at Malena DeMartini, and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and all of those. But there's a host of information on my website, many, many free and low cost resources that I encourage people to just go and read blogs and download free handouts. And there's just all sorts of stuff there. And of course, there's information about the certification program. And there's also our online self-paced course for guardians called Mission Possible, and that's available on the website as well.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll put a link in the show notes so that people can go to that. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for watching or listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend about it so that they can enjoy it too. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.